Before we get into this episode, I just want to take a moment to say thank you for all the incredible support and comments lately. I love when y'all reach out and share your thoughts, leave some kind words, or yell at me for getting something wrong. I love hearing from the community, and it really does mean a lot. And to the membership family, I didn't ask permission to call out names, but please know you are absolutely noticed and deeply appreciated. I'm recording this a few days before Christmas, and I'm not sure if it'll be edited and out in time. But either way, I hope everyone is having or had a wonderful Christmas, got to spend some quality time with family, and enjoyed the traditions that come with it. I know I'm definitely looking forward to the food and downtime. And if you don't celebrate Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, or whatever holiday you celebrate. And if you celebrate none of them, I hope you're just having an amazing week. Alright, let's get into the episode. In all history of the Northwest and Indian warfare of modern times, there is no more picturesque character than Frank Grouard. His great service in the many Indian campaigns are within the recollection of the present generation, and the high esteem in which he is held by the foremost Indian fighters of the day are known to all. But to the people of Wyoming, and especially those of Johnson County, among whom he has made his home, and a great number of fast friends during the last decade and more, the portrayal of his adventurous life will be doubly interesting. Frank Grouard is, as becomes one who was trained in all the studied reserve of Indian habits, and who has enjoyed and still retains the intimate confidence of his superior officers, a man of few words. It needed more than ordinary persuasion to unlock the storehouse of his past, and to draw from it the story of the life crowded with adventure, and the results of keen observation and more than usual retentive mind. It is a source of congratulation not only to Frank Grouard, but also to the public, that it fell to the lot of so enterprising and brilliant a journalist as Mr. Joe DeBarthe to become the biographer of so distinguished a character as Frank Grouard. We have been favored with advanced sheets of the life of Frank Grouard, and we do not hesitate to predict that the book will become one of the most popular and valuable historical works of the age. What you just heard was from the Buffalo Bulletin, 15th of November, 1894, titled Life of Frank Grouard, Chief of Scouts. Frank Grouard lived between two worlds, captive and scout, Lakota brother and U.S. Army guide. His life shaped battles, influenced leaders, and left behind a legacy that is still debated today. This is the story of a man whose choices helped define the violent, complicated frontier of the American West. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. When I first read about Frank Grouard, I thought about doing a complete deep dive series into his life, every little detail the way I covered other characters, Seth Bullock, Hugh Glass, and on Spotify, Bass Reeves and Joe Meek. But the deeper I went, the more complicated a deep dive became. Nearly everything we know about him comes from a single book, The Life and Adventures of Frank Grouard, written by Joseph DeBarthe. It's an incredible read, and without it, Frank Grouard would likely be little more than a forgotten name. But it's also a book that contains exaggerations, embellishments, and moments that clearly drift into storytelling meant to sell copies rather than strictly preserve history. Frank Grouard himself was a quiet man, almost deliberately elusive. When DeBarthe first met him at Fort Washakie in 1887, Grouard had partly forgotten his native English and relied heavily on sign language, a habit learned during his years among the Lakota. Introduced through government scout Nelson Charlie Yarnell, DeBarthe found Grouard unwilling to speak, later describing him as a veritable sphinx. Other journalists fared no better, unable to get even a gesture from the silent scout, which only strengthened DeBarthe's determination to hear his story. Years later, after DeBarthe's own reputation collapsed during the Johnson County War and he fled Buffalo, Wyoming, the two men crossed paths again. When DeBarthe asked once more for an interview, Grouard finally agreed, saying simply, "I will give you the story of my life." Even Grouard doubted anyone would believe it or even care to read it. According to Dr. Will Frackleton, who overheard many of these interviews, Grouard insisted on sitting in a dim room with the light falling on DeBarthe's face, a small but telling reminder of the caution he had learned long before. DeBarthe, eager to sell books, added color to what he heard, but beneath that flair are first-hand accounts that remain invaluable. Throughout the episode, I'll be quoting from DeBarthe's book often, because in many places, it is Frank Grouard speaking for himself. When the words or interpretations belong to DeBarthe, I'll make that clear. While parts of this story may sound exaggerated, Frank Grouard's life is no legend. Much of it can be verified, and what is certain is that he lived a hard, violent, and deeply complicated life. In the world of Indian Scouts, Frank Grouard earned a reputation as one of the best. But let's start at the beginning. Frank Grouard was born on the 20th of September, 1850, on the island of Anna in the Tuamotu chain, just east of Tahiti, out there in the Pacific Ocean, and a place far removed from the plains and war trails where his name would later become known. His family history was one of restless movement and hard travel. His great-grandfather was a French Huguenot refugee who crossed the Atlantic in the 17th century, was a privateer during the early American wars, and both his great-grandfather and grandfather were sailors who served aboard U.S. Navy vessels. Frank's father, Benjamin Grouard, carried that same spirit into a religious calling, leaving the United States in 1843 as a missionary to the South Pacific, where he met and married a native woman of Anna. 3 sons were born out of that marriage, Frank being the second. In 1852, with the French asserting control over the islands and life becoming increasingly hostile for foreigners, Benjamin Grouard brought his family to California. Frank was just 2 years old when they arrived in San Francisco, but the change proved too much for his mother. Within a year, she returned to Anna with Frank's brothers, leaving the boy behind in the United States. Frank would never see his mother or siblings again. His father remained in California for several years before placing young Frank in the care of Addison Pratt, a fellow missionary. Soon after, the Pratt family moved to southwestern Utah, where Frank grew up. By the age of 15, restless and determined to make his own way, he ran away. In 1865, Grouard hired on as a freighter in San Bernardino, taking work as a mule skinner, driving freight north to Helena in Montana Territory. His first load carried fine liquors, and the drinking and fighting he witnessed among his fellow drivers left a lasting impression. He later said from that trip forward, he avoided whiskey unless he had what he considered a good reason. For the next 3 years, Grouard worked steadily on the freight lines, learning the trails, the discipline of long-distance travel, and the rough customs of frontier labor. By 1869, he had shifted to breaking horses for the Holiday Stage Company, working through the fall as tensions with nearby tribes grew. That same year, he joined a militia traveling toward Diamond City, east of Helena, where he was hired out as a Pony Express rider for C.C. Huntley. Huntley soon secured the mail contract between Diamond City and Fort Hall in Idaho Territory, a dangerous 211-mile run that Grouard covered in 4 days and nights, riding one pack horse and leading another. He had made several successful trips when, on a return ride in November, he was suddenly surrounded by nearly 20 Blackfeet warriors in full war dress. Dragged from his horse and stripped naked, Grouard was pointed back toward the trail he had come from and told to run. Barefoot, he fled across ground thick with cactus and prickly pear, driven by fear alone. DeBarthe later wrote that nothing but the terror of pursuit kept him moving. Somehow, Grouard reached the gates of Fort Hall alive. For 3 months afterward, he lay on a bed of furs badly wounded and feverish, nursed back to health from the edge of death by John Liver-Eating Johnson, who cared for him with what DeBarthe described as almost maternal devotion. Grouard returned to carrying the mail, despite the growing danger. Few men would take the job, as Sioux war parties were raiding throughout the region, but Grouard continued through the summer and into the fall. On the 2nd of January 1870, at 19 years old, riding with his head down against the falling snow and his buffalo coat pulled tight, he entered a narrow gulch. Suddenly, he was struck from behind. Knocked from his horse, he fought desperately as one man seized his rifle and another tried to tear away his coat. Grouard grabbed the attacker and held him tight, using the man as a shield against his own stolen gun. But watching from a distance, Sitting Bull mistook the struggle for a huge bear standing upright, fighting its captor. When he realized it was a man, he laughed and ordered that Grouard be taken into camp unharmed. During a council to decide his fate, Sitting Bull adopted the young mail carrier as a brother and gave him the name Ugata, meaning standing bear, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Grouard would spend the next 5 years living among the Hunkpapa Lakota, gradually passing from closely guarded captive to accepted member of the tribe, a transformation that would define the rest of his life and leave him forever caught between two worlds. For more than a year after his capture, Frank Grouard lived under close surveillance. Then, after 16 months, Sitting Bull entrusted him with an old flintlock pistol, a small gesture that marked a turning point. Not long afterward, during a gambling game when the Hunk Papa had set their weapons aside, a deer crested a nearby ridge and moved toward the men. With every eye on him, Grouard raised a flintlock and dropped the animal with a single shot at a distance that surprised everyone present. Whether the shot was skill or luck is open to question, but its effect was immediate. When Sitting Bull heard of it, he was pleased and rewarded Grouard with a powder and lead Hawken rifle. From that moment on, Grouard's position changed. Men sought him out for hunting parties, and he was allowed to come and go freely. With that freedom, Grouard roamed the country almost at will. He later claimed to have learned every mountain pass, canyon, and ravine, becoming deeply familiar with the land as only a plainsman could. In recalling those years, Grouard often spoke in the collective, referring to we and us when describing the Lakota. He explained that since escape was impossible at the time, he resolved to study the people among whom he lived, believing he would remain with them until either the US government forced them onto reservations or he achieved his own freedom. Yet his recollections suggest more than observation alone. He formed close relationships, shared hardships, and clearly identified with struggles of the people he lived beside. Grouard described daily life in detail, the duties of men and women, hunting parties, the care of children, dress, ceremonies, and burial customs. He told stories of dangerous buffalo hunts, of falling asleep only to wake surrounded by rattlesnakes, and of moments where survival hinged on instinct rather than strength. From DeBarthe's book, Grouard described an event that took place on a buffalo hunt. Among the Indians, no sport or excitement could equal a buffalo hunt. There was considerable danger in it, but nothing compared with the excitement and joy. Every brave kept a trained pony for the buffalo chase, one that was used for nothing else, and the intelligence of some of those animals was wonderful. I really believe the ponies enjoyed a buffalo hunt as keenly as did their masters. When I became possessed of my first buffalo pony, the Indian from whom I got it told me of all of its good qualities, and laid particular stress upon the face that the animal always gave warning of approaching danger. I paid little attention to the buck's talk at the time, but it was very distinctly recalled on an occasion I'm going to speak of. The Bark Creek country along the Yellowstone River was a great feeding ground for the buffaloes, and one season we moved our camp down there. Our supply of meat had got very light, and we also wanted robes with which to make lodges. We killed a great many buffaloes during our stay in that locality, and were about ready to move. It was decided to have one more hunt before leaving, and preparations were made accordingly. The buffaloes had drifted some distance from our camping ground, and the Indians were in the habit of moving camp from day to day as the chase progressed. When we started off in the last hunt, the entire camp went along, and as soon as their herd of buffaloes was sighted, the bucks jumped upon their ponies and began the chase. On this particular occasion, I became so intent upon running the buffaloes that I got a long way in advance of the other hunters. I killed a couple of buffaloes and got off my horse to skin them, fastening my pony to the carcass of one of the dead animals. While I was at work, my pony began acting strangely. It would run in a half circle, then back again, and seemed to be trying to attract my attention. I paid no particular heed to the actions of the pony until I recalled what its former owner had told me about its giving warning of danger. When I untied it, jumped upon its back, and rode up on a hill to see if anything unusual was occurring, seeing nothing, I returned to my work. The pony began to caper about worse than ever, and I finally became so nervous and frightened that I left my two buffaloes and started back to where we had left the pack animals. I had not gone over 2 miles before I heard shooting, and glancing over my shoulder in the direction from which I had come, I saw a large party of Crow warriors charging down onto our people. I gave the alarm as quickly as I could, but before the Sioux warriors could get together, the enemy had killed 19 of them and departed. My pony had sniffed the danger while I was skinning the buffaloes, but I failed to find the least sign of the attacking party, and supposed my animal was restless at being separated from the rest of the pony herd. If it had not been for the actions of the pony, I would have been caught in a nice trap and lost my life. From that time on, I always kept a sharp lookout, and if my pony gave any signs that there was danger in the air, I heeded them. In 1873, Grouard nearly lost his life after angering Sitting Bull. He told him he was leaving to steal horses, but instead rode to Fort Peck on the Missouri River to warn soldiers about traders who were supplying whiskey to the Lakota under an exclusive agreement with Sitting Bull. Santee Lakota recognized him at the post and reported his actions. When Sitting Bull learned of it, Grouard later said he had never seen an Indian so enraged. Sitting Bull threatened to kill him, and only the intervention of Sitting Bull's mother prevented violence. After that incident, Grouard did not remain long in the Hunkpapa camp. Moving on, Grouard encountered several other Lakota bands along the Yellowstone before joining an Oglala camp. It was there that he first met Crazy Horse. Grouard described him as a quiet, young-looking, light complexion with sandy hair and a few powder marks on one side of his face. After living with him and seeing him in battle, Grouard later said, quote, "Crazy Horse was the bravest man I ever knew or met, white, red, or black." During these years, Grouard experienced firsthand the growing desperations of the Lakota. Buffalo were disappearing, hunger was constant, and ammunition was scarce. The so-called hostile bands survived by trading with the reservation Indians, who received supplies from government agents, allowing them to remain free without surrendering to promises that, as Grouard observed, were rarely kept. After years of quietly waiting for the right moment, Frank Grouard finally regained his freedom in 1875. With treaty talks underway and tensions rising over the Black Hills, he found himself moving between the Red Cloud Agency and the so-called hostile camps, acting as a go-between rather than a captive. Grouard was tasked with seeking out Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and inviting them to the agency to discuss the possibility of a new treaty. He met them near present-day Dayton, Wyoming, where a massive council was held. After more than 100 men spoke, the decision was made that while some might choose to sell their land and go with Grouard, the majority would remain and fight. When Grouard returned to the agency, he was paid roughly $500 for his efforts, enough to buy proper clothes and for the first time in nearly 6 years, live as a free man. Freedom came with its own challenges. Grouard later said it took him 2 to 3 months just to relearn how to properly speak English. Once his work as a mediator ended, he simply left. There was no dramatic escape, no single defining break, just a quiet departure from a life that could no longer hold him. He made his way back to familiar ground, reconnecting with a man he had known before his capture, rancher J.W. Deere. Grouard also became acquainted with several Army officers. Among them was Captain Egan of K Company, 2nd Regiment, known as the White Horse Cavalry. Deere and Captain Egan would send Grouard's name to headquarters, quote, as a man who knew the country. In early 1876, Grouard was summoned to meet General George Crook. Riding nearly 90 miles overnight to Fort Laramie, he arrived the next morning and sat down with Crook to discuss the coming winter campaign. Grouard told him there was a chance of surprising Indian villages if the operation was handled correctly. Crook offered him a position as a scout at $125 a month, roughly $3,800 today, a significant wage at the time. Grouard accepted, and by March 1876, he was officially riding with Crook's command. Dressed like an Indian and fluent in Lakota ways, he quickly made himself indispensable, guiding columns through harsh terrain and locating enemy camps that others could not find. Newspaper correspondents and soldiers alike took notice. Reporters wrote admirably of Grouard's tracking ability, recounting stories of him following faint trails through blizzards when others saw nothing at all. Soldiers remarked that while the Indians knew the country well, Grouard knew it just as intimately. General Crook, when speaking of Frank Grouard, stated, quote, "I would sooner lose a third of my command than Frank Grouard." Yet admiration was never universal. Rumors followed Grouard constantly. Some officers suspected him of warning villages before attacks, noting how he sometimes disappeared during the heaviest fighting. Those suspicions were fueled by Grouard's own awareness of the danger he lived with daily. He knew that if the Lakota ever caught him acting as a traitor, the punishment would be slow and brutal. He later explained that while the Indians watched him closely, he watched them just as carefully. His loyalties were never simple. Grouard fought alongside Crook in major campaigns: the Rosebud, Slim Buttes, Red Fork, actions against Crazy Horse, the Nez Perce War, and countless smaller engagements. Yet his life story is filled with moments of quiet conflict and guilt over the cost of his knowledge. That conflict followed him to the end of the Indian Wars. In 1890, Grouard was nearly present at Wounded Knee. Ordered out with Colonel Forsyth's command, he was recalled before reaching the scene. Grouard later believed the catastrophe that followed stemmed from the misunderstanding on both sides, and that it might have been avoided. In his absence, between 150 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children were killed. By then, Grouard's life had become a record of divided allegiance, a man shaped by the Lakota, employed by the United States, and haunted by the human cost of standing between two worlds. Now, you heard me mention that Frank scouted at the Battle of the Rosebud. DeBarthe's book lays out each campaign and battle he took part in, and as I've said before, it's well worth the read. What I am about to share comes directly from Frank himself, his own account of the Battle of the Rosebud, and while it is long, I believe it shows just how invaluable he was as a scout. The General George Crook asked me, upon my arrival in camp from my trip to the village of the Friendly Crows, if I had any idea where the Sioux camp was. From all signs I had seen, I supposed they were on the Rosebud, and I so informed him. He told me that he wanted to start as soon as he could get ready. 2 days afterward, the infantry was mounted on mules, and the command started for the Rosebud, leaving the wagon train upon the Big Goose about a mile from the works. We traveled in light marching order, taking as little with us as possible, much less than we needed. The first night out, we camped on Tongue River near the mouth of Big Goose. The next morning, starting off through the hills over to Badger Creek, sending out 2 parties of scouts from there to try to discover the Sioux village. There being plenty of buffalo along the line of march, the Indians killed hundreds of them. Camping on the Rosebud, we ran into a scouting party of Sioux just before reaching the river, but from the direction they took, I was satisfied the camp was on the Rosebud down the stream. The next morning, we moved toward the big bend of the Rosebud and went into the temporary camp there to await the report of the scouts, who had been sent out to discover the hostile village. We had not reached the big bend before we went into camp. It was the morning after the scouts had been sent out that the Sioux were reported to be coming in large numbers. Then we moved down to the Big Bend. There we laid out our arms and rested, without unsaddling. Our Indian allies had caught up their horses, ready for anything that happened to turn up. The scouts commenced to come in then, telling us that the Indians were coming. Not having much experience with the troops, I could not tell whether they were ready to meet the enemy or not, but I suppose that they were always ready for a fight and did not pay much attention to them. It was not long before an Indian they called Humpy, a little hunchback Sioux, came riding down over the hills as fast as his horse could carry him, hollering Sioux as he came into camp. And he said that the Sioux were charging on us, and almost at the same time, you could hear the Sioux war cry. The Indians and scouts jumped on their horses, and just then the Sioux came charging down over the hills. But the troops were not ready to meet the attack, so the Crows met the first charge of Indians, and I believe if it had not been for the Crows, the Sioux would have killed half our command before the soldiers were in a position to meet the attack. It was a hand-to-hand fight for quite a while between the Crows and Sioux. It was a kind of plateau where they were fighting, and the troops were down under the hills. I charged up the hill when the Shoshones and Crows started out, so that I could see everything that occurred. It was all of 20 minutes, I think, before the soldiers appeared over the hill. As soon as the soldiers came up and commenced fighting, the Sioux fell back. The coming together of Sioux, Crows, and Shoshones, I think, was the prettiest sight in a way of a fight that I had ever seen. They were all mixed up, and I could hardly distinguish our allies from the hostiles. After the fight became general with the troops, our Indians drew back. I passed where one Crow was sitting on the ground, and he didn't act as if he was one bit hurt. He was watching the fight between the Indians, and every once in a while he would yell like a madman. He was unable to get to his feet, having been shot just above the knee, and the bone was terribly shattered. His horse was lying dead by his side. He seemed to be so interested in the fight that he had entirely forgotten his wound. The soldiers could not tell one Indian from another, but the Redskins knew each other all right. And if a man was familiar with them, he would know. But it was very hard to keep the soldiers from firing into our allies after the troops became engaged with the Sioux, mistaking the Crows and Shoshones for the enemy. After the troops came up, they formed into line and commenced driving the Sioux back. Then the Shoshones, Crows, and Sioux commenced separating. The friendly Indians came back, and the Sioux went into the hills. The soldiers kept driving the hostiles back until they got them on a big flat beyond the first line of hills. Colonel Guy V. Henry with his battalion was stationed to the left, and he was ordered up the river. Mills' battalion was down below on the right, and the other battalions were in the center of the fight. The Crow and Snake Indians got scattered out, but would keep in behind the troops, out of harm's reach as much as possible. I was close to the position held by General Crook, and he was in about the center of the field. The general ordered a battalion to charge the Indians and drive them back. In the charge that followed, one poor fellow's horse ran away with him, and the animal went right for the Indians, just as the order had been given to retreat. The horse kept straight ahead after the command had driven the Indians away, and turned back and ran up to within 40 or 50 yards of the hostiles before they turned. Of course, they began shooting at the horseman, and his horse began to turn. Both of his hands were shot off at the wrist. While he came past me, both of his hands were dangling. The Indians had turned the horse by firing at it. I rode up on the hill, and the poor fellow was calling for someone to check his horse. I rode very rapidly and tried to get ahead of the frightened animal, and then I could see his hands dangling from his wrist. I tried to head off the horse, but the animal got in ahead of me, started down the divide, and went through the troops, never stopping for anything. The Indians were on that side of the flat fighting, and he went through the line of troops towards them, and I went after him. I got up as close as I could to him. My horse was a fast one, but I could not reach the runaway animal's bridle, and whip as much as I could, I was unable to grasp it. If he had been a man of any nerve, or had not lost his head, he might have helped to turn the horse by grasping the reins with his wrist. I hit the horse over the head as hard as I could in an effort to turn him, but the horse was stubborn and frightened and was not very easily turned. I told the wounded man to throw himself off when I hit the horse the second time. He gave me one look that I will never forget. I got up as close as I could to the horse and hit it on the side of the head. The blow turned the horse some, but not clear around, and the wounded man threw himself off. The horse went right in among the Indians and was lost to view. The wounded man picked himself up and ran down the hill out of sight. The Indians were shooting at us all the time. When I got back to the command, the Indians were going down below us, and the general had sent all of his aides out with orders to the different commanders. It was right after this runaway horse incident occurred that the Indians got Colonel Henry's battalion in a tight place and seriously wounded the gallant officer. The Indians were pressing down very close. Henry's battalion received an order to retreat, but I do not know who gave that order. I suppose while standing there, Colonel Henry was shot. As quick as they commenced to retreat, the Indians rushed down. Ute John made a dash to the place where the colonel fell, got off his horse, and turned it loose just as the Indians got to Colonel Henry. Single-handed, he stood them off until the soldiers commenced shooting and drove the Indians away. In the meantime, Ute John, as quick as the Indians were driven away, put Colonel Henry on his back and carried him over to where Henry's battalion was. If it had not been for the Indian, Ute John, Colonel Henry would have been killed and scalped where he fell. The battalion that was on the other side of Henry had retired at the same time that Henry's battalion retreated. I saw an Indian run right in among the soldiers as they were retreating. I don't know whether it was done purposely, but I saw a soldier hold up a gun as though he were giving it to this Indian, but I think the gun was held up to protect his head from a blow aimed at it by the Sioux. There were several soldiers killed. It was right after Henry was shot that I went over to where General Crook was. There were no aides there with him, so he told me to go down and tell Captain Mills to drive the Indians out of the Rosebud Canyon. I went down and carried the order to Mills. It was but a short time afterwards that one of the aides came to me and said the general wanted to see me. When I got to Crook, he said, quote, "I'm going to move down Rosebud Canyon and want you to go, with 2 battalions, as far as you can handle the defile and find out whether the village is on the other end of the canyon or not." I went down the canyon with 2 battalions. After getting down into the rocky pass and seeing what was going on amongst the Indians, I became convinced they would not attack us, would not pay any attention to a detachment when they had wanted the entire command. I was aware of this as quick as I got in there. They wanted to draw the entire command down into this canyon and massacre every soul. I had not been in the canyon 20 minutes before I knew what was going on. The canyon rose to a height of 1,000 feet on both sides of us. The Indians had all of this fortified. I had got almost through the canyon when 2 companies when an aide-de-camp, Colonel Nickerson, overtook us. The Indians had tried hard to draw the command down into the canyon, and the general thought it was a fresh attack made and wanted the 2 battalions to come back to the field and take the Indians in the rear, wanted us to come up and behind them. So, Going up into the right of the canyon on the north side, we attempted to come in between the Redskins. But the Indians watched all our movements, and before we could get in behind them, they had drawn off. I had seen all I wanted to see to convince me what was going on, and when I got back, the general was just ready to start down the canyon. In fact, the whole command had started when I met it. I asked General Crook where they were going. He said, "Down to take the village." "You can't go through the canyon," I told him. He asked why. I said, "You can't go through. They will kill your whole command if you attempt to go through there." He could not believe that, laughed quietly about it. I did everything I could to dissuade him, and the only way I could prevail on him to abandon the undertaking was by telling him there was no ammunition in the command. The scouts didn't have any, and a great number of companies didn't have any, and when the general gave orders to find out how much ammunition there was, it didn't average 10 cartridges to the man, and that was the only thing that stopped him. In fact, it was the only thing that saved his command because he would have made the attempt to go through the canyon under any other circumstances. When Crook made up his mind to do anything, it was generally done. The only way I could convince him not to go was by satisfying him of there being no ammunition in the command. I had seen all day how the Indians and troops were firing, and especially the scouts, so I asked the general to find out the amount of ammunition each company had. He found he would have to wait until he got more ammunition from the wagons before taking the offensive. We went into camp at the lower end of the battlefield. As far as the fight was concerned, I don't think either side could claim a complete victory, although the troops held the ground. The Indians had tried to lead the troops down through the canyon where they had fortified on each side, and if the troops had gone down there would not have been one of them left to tell the tale. For the Indians were fixed in such a way that they could crossfire them without getting hurt themselves, or could have even rolled rocks down in amongst them and crushed them. Seeing this while I was going down through the canyon is the reason I tried so hard to stop the command from going through. To sum up the whole battle, there was 28 soldiers killed and 56 wounded. One of the Indian scouts was killed, and 3 of them wounded. On the Indian side, there were 13 of them killed that I know of, and I could not tell the number that were wounded, but there was a good many of them. The next morning, we started back to the wagon train. Starting up the Rosebud, we camped at the head of it. After we had been in camp some time, the Crow allies got stampeded for some cause, drove in their ponies, saddled them up, and left us, starting back to their village, taking their wounded along with them, and nothing we could say or do would stop them. Breaking camp the next morning, we reached a wagon train in the same evening, and the train and a large escort of troops were sent back to Fetterman for supplies. Now there were 2 questions that always came up when Frank Grouard's name is mentioned. Was he the first one who discovered what happened to George Armstrong Custer? And what role, if any, did he play in the death of Crazy Horse? These questions have followed Grouard for more than a century, and like much of his life, the answers are often oversimplified or misunderstood. The short answer is that Grouard was not present at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, but he was the first of the men to understand what had happened there. According to Grouard's own account, he noticed Indian smoke signals in the days following Custer's march, and immediately believed they signaled a major victory for the Sioux. From his years living with the Lakota, he understood their meaning far better than most officers. When he reported this to his superiors, they dismissed the idea and laughed it off. Frustrated, Grouard insisted on writing out to confirm what he had already believed to be true. As he traveled, the signs became impossible to ignore. Grouard found clear evidence of a large engagement and recognized where Reno and Custer had separated their commands. Following the trail, he reached a point where Custer had attempted to cross the creek before being turned back. By the time he reached this area, night had fallen, forcing him to press on cautiously through the darkness. At one point, his horse refused to move forward on the trail. When Grouard dismounted to see why, he discovered the severed head of a scalped soldier lying in the trail. It was the moment that confirmed his fears. Searching for safer ground, he eventually picked up an Indian trail and followed it to the outskirts of the Sioux village. There, he encountered an elderly man rounding up some horses and attempted to gather what information he could, but Grouard was recognized. What followed was a running pursuit of nearly 40 miles. Grouard barely escaped, eventually circling back and making his way to the army camp days later. When he returned, he confirmed what had already begun circulating as a rumor, that Custer and his command had been destroyed. Grouard had not fought at the Little Bighorn, but his knowledge, instincts, and reconnaissance made him one of the earliest witnesses to the scale and finality of the disaster. Now, the death of Crazy Horse. Before we get into this, it's important to be clear about one thing. I'm not here to settle the debate over exactly how Crazy Horse was killed. That is a story all of its own, and it's still deeply contested. What matters here is whether Frank Grouard truly bears responsibility for Crazy Horse's death, as he is so often accused, and whether a mistranslation by Grouard set those events in motion. By the summer of 1877, Crazy Horse had surrendered his weapons so his people would not starve, only to find himself once again under suspicion. When the army asked him to take up arms against the Nez Perce, Crazy Horse replied with what appears to have been sarcasm, saying he would fight until not a Nez Perce was left. According to several sources, Frank Grouard, who acted as an interpreter and did not get along with Crazy Horse, translated the statement in a far more threatening way, telling officers that Crazy Horse meant he would fight until not a white man was left. Whether this was a deliberate distortion, a misunderstanding, or shaped by a personal bias remains impossible to prove, but the effect was immediate. General Crook accepted the interpretation and approved Crazy Horse's arrest. From there, events moved quickly. Crazy Horse was lured to Camp Robertson under promises of fair treatment, only to discover he was placed under arrest. When he realized he was being taken to the guardhouse, a struggle broke out. During that chaos, Crazy Horse was mortally wounded and died later that night. Who actually inflicted the fatal wound remains uncertain. Some accounts say a soldier's bayonet struck him. Others insist his own knife was turned against him in the struggle. Even eyewitnesses present that night disagreed, and the Army's version never fully settled the matter. But Frank Grouard tells a very different story. I'm not going to read his whole account. I'll summarize it a bit and focus on the important parts. In Frank Grouard's telling, the events that led to Crazy Horse's death began months earlier with what he believed was a genuine assassination plot. After Crazy Horse surrendered in the spring of 1877, under assurances of peace, Grouard claimed unrest quickly followed. According to him, secret councils were held among dissatisfied warriors, and word reached him that a plan existed to murder Lieutenant William P. Clark, kill Grouard himself, and then massacre the whites of the post. Grouard said he infiltrated one of these councils disguised as an Indian, listening as the plan was laid out in detail. Believing the plot real, he attempted to disrupt it by confronting the conspirators indirectly. When the hostile council members came to his home the following day, he told them of a dream that he had had that night, that he saw them and Crazy Horse plotting a murder of Lieutenant Clark and himself. Then he warned Army authorities so they could prepare. Despite the claims of Crazy Horse and Grouard having a hostile relationship, Grouard consistently maintained that his relationship with Crazy Horse was not hostile. In his own words and in accounts from others at the agency, the two men treated one another with respect. Crazy Horse took his first supper after surrendering with Grouard, greeted him warmly, and spoke to him openly. Grouard later described Crazy Horse as a reserved leader whose counsel carried enormous weight among the Oglala, even though he was not a chief. He emphasized that Crazy Horse was not reckless or bloodthirsty, but deliberate, dignified, and deeply concerned with the welfare of his people. According to Grouard, the tragedy unfolded not because of personal hatred or betrayal, but because suspicion and fear overtook reason. After reports of the alleged plot reached General Crook, additional troops were quietly moved in, and orders were issued for Crazy Horse's arrest. When Crazy Horse fled briefly, then surrendered again under the promises of fair treatment, this is what led to the death of Crazy Horse. Grouard noted that he knew Crazy Horse would never submit to confinement. I'm not trying to tell you who was right or who was wrong. The story has too many voices, too many versions, and too much history tied into all of that. All I want to do here is put the information on the table, from every side we have, and let y'all decide what you think really happened. After the Indian Wars wound down, Frank Grouard remained in military service and settled near Fort McKinney, in what is now Buffalo, Wyoming. Though the fighting had largely ended, his work did not. He investigated reports of ghost dance activity at Fort Washakie and helped establish a mail route across the Bighorn Mountains between Sheridan and Hyattville, difficult country that few men knew better. Even as the frontier changed, Grouard continued to serve quietly, living much as he always had, close to the land and far from public attention. In 1893, word of Grouard's life story and the upcoming publication of his biography unexpectedly reunited him with his father, who had believed for decades that his son was dead. After 37 years apart, the two men met at the Sheridan Depot. Witnesses later recalled that no words were spoken as they embraced, the moment carrying more weight than any conversation could. Grouard's father stayed with him in Wyoming for several weeks, though the high altitude took a toll on the elderly man's health. After returning to California, he suffered a fatal decline and died the following year, having finally learned the truth about his long-lost son. Those who knew Grouard in his later years spoke highly of him. Historian Jim Cachell became a close friend and traveled with him to old battlefields, relying on Grouard's fluency in Sioux to interview native participants and gather first-hand accounts of the wars. Cachell later wrote that every man connected in the campaigns of 1876, native and non-native alike, praised Grouard's skill and character, calling him the most valuable scout associated with the U.S. Army. Newspapers of the time echoed that sentiment, describing him as a man of few words whose life had been crowded with adventure and quiet observation. Despite that reputation, Grouard's final years were marked by hardship. His health declined, his finances failed, and by the early 1900s he was reduced to manual labor to survive. In August of 1905, he died of pneumonia in the hospital in St. Joseph, Missouri. Though buried with the kindness of local citizens, many noted the injustice of his end. A man who had given the best years of his life to the country, only to be forgotten once his services were no longer needed. His story closed not with honor or reward, but with quiet neglect. Frank Grouard's life doesn't fit neatly into hero or villain, and that may be the most honest thing about this story. He lived between two worlds, serving both, fully belonging to neither, and paying a heavy price for that position. His actions shaped battles, influenced leaders, and altered lives, even as his own story faded into controversy and contradiction. Whether remembered as a hero, a betrayer, or something in between, Frank Grouard's story reminds us that frontier survival often demanded impossible decisions, and that history is rarely as simple as we want it to be. I hope you all enjoyed this episode on Frank Grouard. One fun note, the Wyoming State Museum has in their possession Frank's Colt single-action Army revolver, artillery model. Maybe. I'll leave a link to the video in the show notes for y'all to check it out. If you did like the video, please give a thumbs up and maybe subscribe. If you are listening on Spotify, please give a rating and give me a follow. All of this really helps the podcast grow, and I can't thank you all enough for the support. Join the membership family. For just $1, you'll get access to bonus content like the Honeywell gunfight. And again, thank you for all the recent people who joined the family. It is very much noticed, and y'all are amazing. We will see y'all next time, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.